thank you very much for braving and forging your way through the rubble to get to this beautiful place. I'd just like to welcome Ricky Burnett and Kevin Shenton. Ricky's obviously, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know Ricky. Is the artist whose work we're celebrating today, and Kevin is the publisher whose book we're celebrating today. This is Kevin's the first book that Kevin has published under his new publishing company called Palimpsest. And we're just here to talk about Ricky's work and the book. And please think up any questions, because towards the end, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to put them to Ricky or Kevin. Kevin, could we just start with you? I mean, this is the first book that you are publishing through Palimpsest. What drew you to Ricky's work initially? I mean, what was appealing to you about Ricky's work?
When Ricky had his exhibition last year and I did the catalogue, I sat with him in his studio one Sunday afternoon, which was my first experience of his paintings. And initially when I walked in, I saw all these canvases all around the room, and they just looked black. And I thought, oh, interesting selection of black paintings, and nice textures and whatnot. And I sat there for about a couple of hours with him. I was drinking tea, he was drinking whiskey, we were chatting away. And as the light was changing in the studio, and I was sitting in front of this whole wall of canvases of all different shapes and sizes, it suddenly dawned on me that these so-called black paintings were anything but black. One jumped out as me had a green cast to it, and the next one to it was turning into magentas, and I noticed blues and flicks of yellow and red, and more time I spent with them, the more colours that came out, and the surfaces almost started to seem to move as the sun was moving around and the shadows were changing. And I found it quite fascinating. And the closer I started looking at these paintings, the more I got out of them. But when I did the catalogue for the gallery exhibition, we didn't have enough space to do the pictures justice by doing enlargements or whatever, and it was something I really wanted. I imagined that this would make a superb study for a book. And then by pure chance, a friend of mine, a fellow designer, Liz Witter, was also getting involved in photography, and she wanted to do some fine art photography to see how to do it. And I said, well, why don't you go to Ricky's exhibition and see what you can do with his works. And she spent a couple of days here in the gallery and came away with what a fantastic selection of photographs, which I then decided that would make a great book. So that was basically how this book arrived at. And I'm very pleased with the end result of those fantastic pictures and the works therein.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting if you look at them under the sunlight outside, the colours in the photographs really do come out.
Exactly. But Ricky's paintings need to be lit in a particular way to really bring out the surface textures and the layers of colour that are hidden below. They sort of appear in different lights. There's always something new to see. And by flicking through the book in the sunlight, as you say, Craig, it really shows you another side of it.
Ricky, can you tell us a little bit about the moment you decided to become an artist, and did you start with oil paint, or did you start elsewhere? I mean, did you come to oil paint later? I mean, how did that happen?
Oh, I didn't realise I was going to be asked to stretch that far back.
Oh, we're just giving some context.
I thought
we're going to be here for about 5 hours.
Okay, so, oh goodness, how do you life story?
Well, just the moment you decided to be an artist, not your entire biography.
There was, how do you know there was a moment?
Because I spoke to you about it.
It was a process, Craig. Well, listen, look, I grew up in a sort of not terribly stimulating home. Very little books, very little something. I went to university, did a little bit of medicine, then I did a little bit of sociology and philosophy, and then I broke my leg, and then I looked at Cézanne's paintings while I was lying in bed, probably stoned or something, but I was looking at Cézanne's painting, and I had a kind of, what in retrospect was a revelation. At the time it didn't present itself as such, it just was an urge. But in retrospect it was my admiration for Cézanne grew day by day when I realized that he was a man who could think and feel at the same time. That there was a rational thought process, there was enormous sensitivity in the movement and the decision making. You began to see the workings of a mind, not a picture. As I said to Tamara on the radio the other day, what is depicted if not the horse's nose or the teacup or the teapot or the sunset or whatever, and what is actually held in Cézanne's paintings is a thought process, and it was a very intimate and moving experience to suddenly experience a sense of communion. Again, as I said to her on the radio, art isn't about communication, it's about communion. And I felt it, and I thought, that's worth doing. And
can you tell us
did.
a little bit more about the difference between communing and communicating? I mean, in your current work.
Well, I think as Kevin says, I mean, if you look for the message, you're not going to get it. But if you're prepared to sit with them for a while, you can have an experience. I suppose that's the difference.
And just, can you talk to us a bit about narrative? Because it seems that this idea of communing is quite anti-narrative. And I mean, I noticed in the series of paintings you did after coming back from America that there was a kind of a series of images which, when taken together, seemed to kind of create a kind of narrative. Whereas these seem to be quite against narrative. And yet narrative is something that we can't necessarily avoid. People put narrative on our lives, on the trajectory of our work. And when we walk into a room and we experience a series of images, they create a kind of a narrative. I mean, do you, and of course there's a narrative of your journey from the Goya to the final picture. I mean, are you consciously working against narrative, or is narrative something that you think you might work with in the future?
Well, I'm not sure that I know what I'm going to do in the future, but for now, yeah, I would say working against narrative, in the sense that I feel sort of oppressed by storytelling in pictures, paintings, and sculpture. I get it, and I get it fairly quickly, and most of the time I don't want to get it. It seems to me that if you try and squeeze, you know, I'm much more interested in the distance between a cartoon and a good painting than the similarity between a cartoon and a good painting. And again, a cartoon is an act of communication and an act of storytelling. And I think storytelling belongs in language. This may sound old-fashioned and sort of modernist, but look, one of the interesting things for me was to confront Goya's very obvious storytelling, if you like, or at least his sense of scene, his sense of theatre. There's a tableau, there's an event taking place, especially in the etchings.
Ricky, speak into the microphone.
Oh, good, sorry, I sort of thought you were closer in. Okay, and that there are rhythms and movements inside the narrative that are much more interesting than the narrative itself. In other words, the undercurrent of the story rather than the overcurrent of the story, so to speak. Whatever the story may be, and by hiding the obvious, I think one gets to something much more complex, much more interesting, much more engaging, for me.
Your last two shows at the Evergreen were called Troubled with Goya and Goya Adaptations, which was the most recent. I know you've also done work that's been triggered by Giotto and other artists. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that journey from the Goya? I mean, what do you start with, and what's the process ending up in these pictures?
Okay, so to begin with, in the Troubled with Goya series, the first move is to translate the etching into a painting, very with some sense of fidelity. So I'm copying, actually. But I give myself a format which is not the same as the Goya, so I've got an immediate compositional problem. I can't copy it with too much fidelity, but I can sort of squeeze it in a little bit. And in doing that, you get to read and feel the primary axes of the composition. So then I make that my focus of attention, the primary axes of the composition, where things press, where they let go, where there's a sharp angle, where there's a soft blurring, and I start playing with those until eventually the paint takes over. And this is a point I didn't make the other day, and I should have on the radio. When talking about building up memories in the paint, in the surface of the paint, there's a magical moment that may be only available to me, but I certainly hope it isn't, and I'm pleased that Kevin, at least for one, has spotted it, that there's a moment, it's not just about surface and texture. It's about when that surface and texture and the movements in it and the touch and the feel and all the memories that are embedded in it go through an alchemical transformation. They stop being surface and become a living surface. Now the difference between surface and living surface is huge for me. I can see it, I can feel it, I can battle on a painting month after month after month, and it remains inanimate, dead, just an accumulation of stuff. And then something happens, keep your fingers crossed, something happens and it nicks over into what I can only think of as a living surface, and then I'm on the way. Until that time, it's just slog.
And it seems to be very much about oil paint specifically as a medium. I mean, is oil paint for you unique compared to acrylic or watercolor or some other medium?
Well, I actually dislike acrylic intensely, as many of my students will know, because it's such a dead, unfeeling, rubbery sort of material. It's like painting with melted condoms, actually. I hadn't thought of that before.
It's not as safe.
Oil paint has this wonderful capacity, I think, to, I can't think of another medium, any instrument, language, performance, I can't think of another way of making art that so closely addresses the question of what it's like to have a body, and particularly what it's like to fit into a skin, to have a skin, to something that wrinkles around you or pulls tight around you or is sensitive to all sorts of touch and movements and caresses and jabs and stabs and bleeds. I mean, skin does something quite interesting, really. It holds everything in and it keeps everything out at the same time. And it's this wonderful interface where all these nerve ends are exposed, and oil paint does that better than any other thing I can think of or have yet discovered.
And then what happens when you turn those into photographs? I mean, is something, well, when one photographs those paintings and puts them in a book, is something lost, is something gained? I mean, how's that process going for you?
Okay, confessional time then. Look, it's been fabulous to see them. And Liz did a fantastic job with the printing and photography, and Kevin took everything to Malaysia and they did a fantastic job of the printing, and you look at that and think, does the painting really look like that? And it was Kevin here who said something rather smart to one of my students who said, the photographs look much more interesting than the paintings. And Kevin said, the book is a manual on how they should be shown and how they should be lit, because all the stuff is in the paintings anyway. It's just not easily and readily and immediately available. And that's another thing that interests me, is the fact that they disclose themselves, as I think good art always does, discloses itself slowly. Anything you can get too quickly is probably not worth getting. However, so what has been like? Well, it's been quite difficult to paint, actually, having seen them in the book, because they sit up like a real achievement, and I keep thinking to myself, how do I do that again? And of course you can't. And if it's of any interest, one of the sort of valuable insights that I've gained from this is that I realize every painting is first and foremost an act of regression. I have to go back to the beginning every time and work through the same kind of sort of infantile stuff, the same kind of anxiety about who you are and who you aren't, and how does the surface become alive, and where do you find that aliveness? And you can't go from strength to strength. You go from regression to strength, back to regression again.